in from the waiting room. Wonderful. I think everyone is in from the waiting room now, with just a few folks continuing to arrive. So we can go ahead and get started. A very warm hello to everyone here. Welcome to In My Own Words, Holocaust Survivor Stories. This series is presented by a partnership between the Holocaust Memorial Resource and Education Center of Florida and the USC Shoah Foundation. My name is Serena Ahmed, and I am the program coordinator here at our Holocaust Center. Our mission is to use the history and lessons of the Holocaust to build a just and caring community free of anti-Semitism and all forms of prejudice and bigotry. We are located just north of downtown Orlando, and we are currently open on a limited basis, and I hope we can see many of you at the museum in person soon. It is an incredible honor to introduce our speakers today, Rochy Miller and Kerryn Lehman. First, a very quick note, especially for those joining us for the first time, please know to write your questions into the chat box, and our speakers will try and answer them by the end of the program today. Now for a brief introduction, Rochy Miller and Kerryn Lehman are the daughter and granddaughter of the late survivor, Lea Leibowitz. Originally from South Africa, Rochy now lives in Brisbane, Australia with her husband. She is a retired medical doctor and writer. She holds both medical journalism and Master of Journalism degrees. She is the author of Not Just a Survivor, A Portrait of My Mother. Kerryn was born in South Africa, raised in Australia, and has now made her home in Florida with her husband and children. She is passionate about exploring family history and genealogy, sharing her Bobba's story, and making sure the atrocities of the Holocaust are never forgotten. It is my privilege to now Sorry, I think I was muted for a second. But it is now my privilege to pass this program over to Rochy Miller and Kerryn Lehman. Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. There we go. Thank you so much for having us here today. As Serena said, my name is Kerry Lehman. This over here is a photo of, sorry, we're just having some technological issues here. There we go, perfect. This here is a photo of my grandmother, Lea Leibowitz. And she was known to everybody, whether you were family, friends, complete strangers that she met for the first time, as Bobba. So I think for the rest of today, we probably should keep calling her Bobba. And playing outside is my oldest daughter, Eliza, and hopefully she's not going to interrupt us too many times today, but she has the honor of sharing her Hebrew name, Lea, with that of my Bobba.
Hi, my name's Rochy Miller. I'm in Brisbane, Australia, where it's now Monday morning. I'm so grateful for this opportunity, and I'm really humbled that so many of you are joining us from all around the world to share in our story. Kerry is my daughter, and I feel particularly privileged to have her share this platform with me today, albeit from different sides of the world. And Lea, or Bobba, was my mother. I was fortunate to have her in my life for 46 years, to have been influenced by her, as we all were, in so many ways. Over the next hour, Kerry and I hope to share with you some of her stories and attributes so that you too will get a sense of what an amazing woman she was. If you had met her, within a few minutes, she would have identified herself to you as a Holocaust survivor. And she was a Holocaust survivor. But that certainly was not all that she was. She was so much more.
So for all of my life, I always knew that Bobba was a Holocaust survivor. I can't tell you when I first found out or how I found out. It just seems like it was something that I always knew. And growing up as a child, whenever she would visit, we would spend so many hours. I mean, I remember staying up late in her room for hours every evening, listening to her tell me all of her stories. And she would tell me her stories about her time during the Holocaust. She was first in Kovna ghetto, then 5 concentration camps before being liberated from Bergen-Belsen, a horrendous time during which she lost almost her entire family. But, you know, she'd also, just as important to her, was telling us stories about her early childhood and her upbringing and what her family was like and what her life was like growing up in Lithuania before the Holocaust. So I think perhaps maybe we should start by sharing a little bit about who she was before the Holocaust.
She was born in Lithuania in 1914 into a warm and loving family. She had an older brother, Jaime, a younger sister, Gitta, and a young brother, Morty. And at the time of her birth, she lived on an estate where her father was a farmer and also the groundsman for the estate. My mum always told us that the estate was the summer palace of the Russian Tsar. And she told us about the palace and the grounds in great detail. She had a wonderful childhood. It was filled with family and fun and fishing on the lake and harvesting the food they grew, and generally a joyful time. But there were also occasional episodes of anti-Jewish harassment by the local Polish or Lithuanian soldiers, and she told us about those as well. After a few years, the family moved to Malat, which was a predominantly Jewish village at the time, where her parents, Rachel and Isaac, had built a house, and they owned a restaurant and a bakery. My mother attended primary school in Malat, and then she went on to high school in Vilkomir, which was a town nearby where both she and her brother boarded during the school term. And finally, she went to university in Kovna in a time where many women didn't finish high school. She graduated in 1936 with a degree in biology. She then went on to teach natural science at a Jewish high school. And she told us many stories of her wonderful life with friends, and they just had a normal, healthy, happy life. Eventually, she married Moses or Moka Klompus in 1937. It was just before she turned 23. She had met him a year before when he agreed to tutor her. And after a week of tutoring her, he told her he could no longer teach her because he'd fallen in love with her and wanted to marry her. And by all accounts, he was the love of her life. And they did get married, and they lived in an apartment in Kovna, which was the capital of Lithuania. And then on the 7th of June in 1938, about a year after they were married, my mother gave birth to a son, Michael.
So it sounds like at the time a normal, happy life. She was living with her husband, living with her son, and visiting her family regularly. When, as she described it, on one sunny Sunday afternoon, everything changed in an instant. And that was the day where, totally unexpectedly, Germany invaded Lithuania. So this was her description of that day. You can imagine, we were sitting peacefully on a Sunday, a sunny Sunday morning in June. Because Russia and Germany have got a non-aggression pact and Lithuania is ruled by Russia, we think we are safe. But then we see at about 12 o'clock in the morning, German planes attacking Kovna. That was the capital of Lithuania. Bombs were all the time just booming. That is all that we heard. And from that very minute, we could already not get out into the street because we were straight away arrested or taken away to be shot. And instantly her life and the life of every other Jewish person in Lithuania changed. For the first 10 days after the invasion by Germany, they were assaulted and attacked by the German soldiers, and in fact by many of their Lithuanian neighbors at the time. They were beaten, their property and possessions, their property and their businesses were destroyed, their possessions were stolen, and it was a time when many of them were actually killed. Bobba and her family went into hiding first, but eventually they were rounded up by the Nazis and sent to Kovna Ghetto. And Kovna Ghetto was a fenced area where there were 30,000 Jews that were crammed into an area designed for only 8,000 people. So it was tough. Bobba, her husband, her 3-year-old son, and her mother-in-law, they lived in the hallway and the kitchen of a very small 2-bedroom apartment, which was occupied by 3 other families at the time. So they were cramped, there was very little food. But, you know, Bobba always said that she was actually really lucky at that time because they were able to live together. They had a little bit of food, a little bit of work, and they were actually able to survive at a time when so many others were being killed. So she felt quite lucky during that period. However, they lived like that for about 16 months, and then things changed and things got worse. So what then happened?
Well, out of the blue, the Nazi authorities issued a demand for 2,000 able-bodied men from the Kovno ghetto to be sent to Estonia. And the Judenrat, which was the Jewish council, provided the list with the names of the people, and my mum's husband, Moka's name, was on it. There was also an offer for the men's families to go with them, and if they agreed, they were promised that they could continue to live together. Moka had no option. He had been selected and had to leave. But my mother and her mother-in-law had a choice to make. It was a very difficult decision. By then, the Jews of Kovno's ghetto already knew that they couldn't trust what they were being told. She said, were they really transporting us to a new camp, or are they sending us for extermination? We were deliberating and deliberating, and eventually we decided we are all 4 going together. If they're killing us, they kill all 4 of us and be done with it. If they leave us alone to live and continue, so we continue and struggle through waiting for the war to be finished. And so on the 26th of October, they turned up for transportation to Estonia as a family. But as soon as they reached the meeting point by the railway, they were separated. My mother was sent to be processed before being sent to Vaivara concentration camp in Estonia. Her husband was sent to a camp in an unknown location. And her mother-in-law and her baby son, Michael, who was aged 4 at the time, were sent together to Auschwitz. And she never saw her child again.
I cannot even begin to understand or comprehend the trauma she must have been going through at that time. So the first concentration camp that she went to was Vaivara, and Bobba's description of life there was harrowing. She told the story about the first meal that they received, and this was after the trauma of being separated from her husband and her child, after 3 days in a train with no food, no water, no sanitation, and after the degradation of being shaved, being stripped, and essentially being reduced to a number. So this was her description of that first meal. In the evening, 10 loaves of bread were brought in, and buckets of brown water, supposed to be tea or coffee. A woman was chosen to cut up the bread for 100 people, 200 hungry eyes watching. Some thought portions were bigger, others smaller. You cut off from one and put on the other. Eventually, when all agreed that the portions were almost equal, one woman turned her back to the table, placed a finger on a portion, and a second woman, also standing with her back to the table, holding a list of numbers, called a number, and that portion was given to the woman whose number it was. You can imagine how long it took until we got our first piece of bread after 4 days of hunger. So Vaivara was a labor camp, and they were all put to work. And Bobba was required to stand day after day in the deep snow in just a skimpy dress, cutting down enormous trees. And it was dangerous work, and there were many injuries. And fortunately for her, after 2 weeks, she somehow managed to catch the attention and impress the camp leader, or the Lagerführer. And he actually assigned her the role and responsibility of then running the women's barracks. So the women's barracks she described as follows. she said, the block contained 3 big rooms, each housing 100 women with bunks around the walls. Each bunk was 1 meter wide and was shared by 5 women. Each bunk had straw and a single blanket. We were like sardines. When one had to turn, we all had to turn. One could not turn alone. There wasn't enough room. There was no sanitation provided, so the women used the buckets that the food was brought in as their toilets, and Bobba's job was to clean the buckets and clean the overflow, as well as keep the camp in some semblance of order. Now, given the close proximity everybody was living in and the terrible food that they were receiving, it was inevitable that everybody would get sick. And at this time, many of the inmates died from typhus, which was rampant both at Vivra as well as at most of the concentration camps. And Bobba actually did get sick as well, but she luckily recovered. So eventually Vivra was shut down, and the inmates and the staff there were all transferred to Erida in Estonia, where she landed up running the kitchen at the camp. And after Erida, she moved to Lagedy and then on to Germany to a labor camp near Hamburg. So what was that camp experience like for her?
The camp was called Ochsenzoll, and it was an offshoot of the infamous women's camp known as Ravensbrück. She worked there in an ammunitions factory where she supervised a team of women making bullets for the German soldiers. Her description of the work was as follows. I was quite sure that the bullets we produced never killed anybody. We just didn't know what to do. This had to be done with strict precautions and all, and it wasn't. The bullets were always faulty, and they were returned to the factory to be reworked and remade again and again. But she actually credits this time in the labor camp with saving her life. Because it was run by a private German organization who were paid by the Nazis for their forced laborers, the women were meant to be productive, and so they were treated relatively well. The first Lagerführer here was a retired captain in the Air Force. And according to my mum, he was very good to the women. He used to try and obtain extra food for them and clothing for them, and he really treated them like human beings. It didn't last very long. He was soon reported by the Nazi women for being too good to the inmates, and he was replaced by somebody my mother called a terror. But the Lagerführer's kindness and treatment of them as normal people went a long way to restoring their faith in themselves. And the slightly better food and conditions that they got there enabled her and the other women to build up some reserves with which to survive the last horrendous camp to which they were sent. They were transferred there in March 1945, and that was Bergen-Belsen.
So by that time, the end of the war was nearing and the Nazi defeat was somewhat inevitable. And the Nazis began gathering people from all of the surrounding camps and sending them on these death marches to places such as Bergen-Belsen to die. And Bergen-Belsen was one place where they didn't really have to do very much to kill people. It was infested with typhus. There was no food, no space, no sanitation, no water. So people were just dying in the hundreds every day. And Bobba described it as hell. And this is her description of arriving in Bergen-Belsen. No work, no food, no place to move. Mountains of dead bodies who were thrown out of the windows of the barracks every day, piled into hills outside, covered in snow. There were heaps lying all over. And in the night, the snow covered it, creating pretty white mountains, until April when the snow started to melt. Now you can just imagine, think of it. Tens of thousands of bodies were lying there all the time. And when the snow melted, they were uncovered, starting to rot. That was Bergen-Belsen. But despite the horrors and the brutality of the concentration camps, Bobba also used to tell us some quite awe-inspiring stories that sort of highlighted her coping skills and her integrity and her bravery and her sense of leadership, but also stories that used to highlight the relationships that people formed when in the concentration camps. And for her particularly, she used to talk about the relationships that she had formed with a group of young women who she then called her adopted daughters. So who were these women?
Well, this is a photo taken at Bergen-Belsen almost a year after liberation. It's of my mother and 7 of her adopted daughters. They had all managed to survive together against incredible odds. And the next photo is, you have the next photo, okay?
Sorry.
That's okay. This is a most special item I found among my mother's possessions. It's a handmade booklet that was presented to her by her adopted daughters on her birthday 4 months after liberation as a thank you gift. The cover is made from the uniform of a Canadian soldier who came to Bergen-Belsen at the time. And each page, and many of them are in Yiddish that I can't read, but each page is a handwritten tribute to her from her daughters. In the camps, my mother recognized the importance of connectedness, and she instinctively knew that friendship and belonging helped to overcome the dehumanization that the Nazis were trying to perpetrate. You know, the concentration camp was not comprised of one uniform mass. They were a collection of Jewish people from all walks of life. To Hitler, they were all the same, they were Jews. But in fact, they weren't homogeneous. They came from different countries, different backgrounds, cultures, professions. Often they didn't even speak the same language. So my mum sought out those women with some commonality, similar schooling, Hebrew language, similar values. And she gathered around her a group of about 10 younger women, and she became their leader, their surrogate mother, so to speak. And she talked of them always as her girls or her adopted daughters. They looked out for each other. They made sacrifices for each other. And they all survived together. She described the group in the following way. She said, we were mostly from Kovna, from Lithuania, our group. We were all the time like a whole group. We always were standing together, and this helped us a lot because we could utilize a little bit of our mental exercises. We came from one place, so we had the same schooling. We had the Hebrew language, all of us. And whenever we had a chance, we were just sitting and telling each other stories about what we had studied or stories from home, trying not to forget who and what we are. Let me tell you some of the stories to show how they looked after each other. In all of the concentration camps except Oxensoll, they were literally starving almost all of the time. The usual food was 1/10 of a loaf of bread and some watery soup, and this had to last for 24 hours. One of her girls was a teenager, a small, frail little girl, and she struggled to make it through the 24 hours between one meal and the next. And as the day wore on, she would faint from hunger. This was really putting herself at huge risk for deportation because any show of weakness was an indication that you couldn't produce anything, it was time to leave. And my mum knew it. So she made a plan to save her life. She gathered the others and she arranged with each of them to retain a little of their daily bread in order to give to this girl during the course of the day and prevent her from fainting. For women who received so little, it was a huge sacrifice. But my mother asked it of them and they all complied, and consequently this child survived. There is another story that tells about their generosity to people outside of their group. When they were transferred to Stutthof, which was a staging point before they were moved to a new concentration camp near Hamburg, they noticed a young girl from a different camp who had been pulled aside and been selected for transport to extermination. And the group made a decision to try to save her. This is my mother's description. So we, the Kovner girls, got together. First of all, some of them knew that little girl. What were we going to do about it? A Russian lady was in charge of watching them. She was looking after them. We still had something hidden, a chain, a watch, some money, someone had a ring. So we decided to put together a parcel. I approached this woman, I could speak Russian, and I told her what we would give her if she would take out this young girl for us. And she did. We took her back to the barrack where we were. Chayana, she wasn't so little, she was 14, but she looked like 10. She remained with me and became my adopted daughter. My mother also benefited from this group relationship. After a time in the concentration camp, she became ill with typhus and was sent to the so-called medical facility. There was no medical care in the medical facility, but they got a daily visit from a doctor and a nurse. And as luck would have it, the nurse was one of her girls. Most people died of typhus in this facility, but my mum somehow recovered. Before she was well enough to leave the medical facility, however, the camp was closed to avoid the approaching Russian army. And the staff and occupants were moving to a new camp. But the authorities had no idea about what to do with the people in the medical facility. So they simply wrapped them in their blankets and threw them outside onto the snow and left them to die. At great personal risk, 2 of her adopted daughters came to find her, and they brought clothes with them and they dressed her, and she was too weak to walk, but they carried her between them. They dragged her to the place where the rest of the camp had been assembled, and they slipped her into the line with all the healthy inmates, supporting her as they marched in groups of 10 towards the train. And the nurse had a key to a carriage that had medical equipment, and she unlocked it and pushed my mother in and locked her in. And against all odds, thanks to their actions, she survived. There are so many lessons to take out of these stories. There are acts of kindness that defy description, acts of humanity that encompass empathy and caring and looking after the group above oneself for the benefit of everybody. Can you begin to imagine the degree of generosity involved when you're starving and you still are willing to share the most meager of rations to save someone else's life? Or when the needs of somebody else drive you to part with your last possessions that you have as a bargaining tool, or you risk your very life to drag somebody away from certain death. And these were the incredible selfless qualities that these women exhibited again and again. I think they were heroes, not just survivors.
I agree. They absolutely were. So after the war ended, Bobba was liberated from Bergen-Belsen on the 15th of April, 1945 by the British and American allies. How did she describe that day of liberation?
She remembered it vividly. She said, we knew that something is going to happen and we are going to be either liberated or killed. Something is going to happen to us. And on the 15th in the morning, they had switched off the electrifying fence, and we saw 2 motorbikes coming not through the gate, but straight through the fence. The motorbike jumped through the fence onto the Appelplatz. We couldn't get out through the door because the place was all blocked up with dead people. So a few of us, I jumped out through the windows to see what's happening. And the uniforms of the two men that came onto the Appellplatz weren't the German grey uniforms, they were beige. As we came out of the windows onto the Appellplatz, the German guards came forward to hit us, to chase us back. And one of the two motorbike men came up to the guard and ripped off his epaulets. And he said to us in English, "Don't be afraid, you are free." Just a day after liberation, my mother negotiated with the officials of the British Army to move the relatively well women who had come from Oxenzoll into the newly vacated barracks where the German guards had been living. And this enabled them to avoid the typhus that was ravaging everyone else in the camp. And this action almost certainly saved many of their lives.
So her parents, her siblings, her husband, her child, most of her friends, they were all killed. 6 million Jews were murdered. How did she survive?
She usually answered people who asked this question that it was a miracle. But she would also explain that survival during the Nazi regime was 95% chance, the chance of not being selected for transportation, the chance of not being randomly shot or beaten to death. But there was 5% outside of that chance. So if you were given that chance, you had some influence over the other 5%. And I think she influenced that 5% by her innate strengths, her determination, her steel will not to succumb. And she had a singular focus that she was going to survive, or she wanted to survive no matter what. But no matter what, for my mother, was always in the context of her morality and her humanity. She would never do anything that it would endanger another inmate's life. And with her survival, she tried really hard to take other people to survival with her.
And she was also so courageous and brave. And I think that she put herself in some situations where she could try to establish herself as a leader, as a way of maybe having a little bit of control or influence over some aspects of her time in the concentration camps. So she used to tell the story about when she was in Vivera, and there was a Jewish Polish man, the capo, and his job was to help the SS guards. And he used to come and collect the women every day and take them out to the forests for their work. And he was unnecessarily brutal. He used to beat the women, especially if they didn't comply. And so one day she approached him and she told him that she would take over organizing the roster of the women. And all he needed to do was tell her how many women he needed every day to go out to the forest. And she would make sure that that number of women were there ready and waiting, as long as he no longer hit anybody. And he reluctantly agreed to this plan. So she gathered the women in the barracks around her and she set up this roster that she then managed. And the plan was to give, to send out the young women out into the forest, give them a few days in the forest and then swap them out so that they all got a bit of a break before going back out again. And while the younger women were out there working, the old women and the young girls were staying in the barracks, keeping it clean and orderly, and I suppose making it as hospitable as possible for the women who are out there in the fields and the forests working. So, that's the plan that she implemented. And it didn't take long until the Lagerführer, or the camp leader, noticed that this barracks and that this camp was running more efficiently and in quite an orderly fashion. So I think she inadvertently gained his respect through this, but more importantly, she actually gained the respect and the love of the women in the barracks, because now their lives had just become just a little bit more bearable during those times.
I also think her survival was facilitated by her language skills. She spoke about 8 languages. And These skills were a natural tool in her leadership roles. Being able to speak the language of your aggressor facilitated her bravery and her outspokenness and her decisions to stand her ground and approach authority with confidence. She could speak to the Nazi leader in German. She could negotiate with a Russian lady in Russia. And she could get information from the Hungarian sanitator in the medical facility in Hungary. And I'm sure her ability to do this gave her a subliminal advantage in all her dealings with all these people.
And I think it was those language skills, as well as her intelligence and her leadership capabilities, that then continued to help her and serve her throughout the rest of her life. So after the Holocaust, Bergen-Belsen became a displaced persons camp, and Bobba organized a kosher kitchen at the camp, as well as being the private secretary to the British commanding officer of the displaced persons camp. Afterwards, she then made her way to South Africa in 1946. And this is where her older brother, the only family member that she had really that survived, the only sibling that survived, he had gone there in 1927 prior to the Holocaust. So in 1946, she moved there. She was actually the first survivor to arrive in South Africa, albeit on a visitor visa, because South Africa, like most countries at the time, were not accepting any Jewish Holocaust survivors. In South Africa, she worked, she studied. She then went on and met and married Samuel, your dad. And then a few years later, she had two daughters. First, her older daughter, Sheila, and then you, Mum. So how did you find out that Bobba had this previous family and this whole life before you? And how do you think her being a Holocaust survivor affected you growing up?
I think we just always knew, in the same way that you probably just always knew. It was just part of who she was and part of who we were. In our home, the Holocaust took center stage. There were framed photographs of her parents, of her baby. I do remember as a very young child going through her dressing table drawer and finding a photo of her and a man who clearly was not my father, and confronting her. And she explained that he had been her first husband. She was always involved in Holocaust associations, always speaking at memorial functions, which we had to attend from very young. It was never hidden. It was just absorbed into the very fabric of who we were. I don't think my mum being a survivor really affected me growing up. Certainly not in a tangible way that I could identify as being due to her Holocaust experience, rather than that my parents perhaps were immigrants. I did know my parents were different to those of my friends who were second generation South Africans and younger than my parents. I think my sister felt more strongly compromised by my mother's past. Her friends' parents were also survivors and immigrants. And so I think her exposure was greater. She was also the older child. And I think maybe my mum had more expectation of her in the role of replacement to her lost child. I remember Sheila harboring resentment at the Holocaust, and she felt my mother's involvement was somehow competing with her needs as a child. But I don't remember feeling that. It was simply what it was.
Now, I know Bobba always placed a great emphasis on education and studying, and I still find it remarkable that, as a young Lithuanian Jewish woman, she was able to go ahead and get an education, university education, but that wasn't the first of her studies or the end of her studying, I mean. So what did education mean to her?
Everything. She revered education. My mum was extremely intelligent. Even as a very young child, she showed amazing talent for language and maths. She, as you said, went to university in Lithuania at a time when many women weren't able to complete high school education. My mum was a pragmatist. When there was a problem, she would solve it. First with her own brand of common sense. And if that was inadequate, then she would go out and receive some kind of suitable qualification to facilitate the solution. She always studied. Aside from the various diplomas that she gathered as her practical necessities to problem solve, study for my mum was, I think, therapeutic. It gave her an opportunity to immerse herself in something that demanded her conscious attention. It wasn't that she wanted to forget her past, but she just wanted something to demand her conscious day-to-day attention, to have a legitimate reason not to have to constantly relive her Holocaust experiences. And for many years, she avoided the inevitable nightmares that she would get by studying. She would sit at the dining room table every night instead of going to bed and fall asleep working and wake up and start again. And so over her lifetime, in addition to her original Lithuanian degree in natural sciences, she got degrees in arts, a BA Arts, a BA Honors, Bachelor of Education, and finally, when she was already in her 70s, she did a PhD.
And not just a PhD, but a PhD in Holocaust literature. So kind of amazing that, you know, she lived through the time physically and emotionally, and now she was able to separate herself and study it from an academic perspective. For as long as I can remember, Bobba was always educating others about the Holocaust. She volunteered at Holocaust museums. She went into schools and shared her experience and her stories. She gave university lectures, interviews, TV, radio. She was famous for talking, or infamous for talking to everybody she met, especially on buses. If you happened to be next to her, you would have heard her whole story within 5 minutes. So it was her mission, it was her legacy to share her stories in the hope that people would learn from it and that they would never forget and that it could never happen again. You recently wrote a book called Not Just a Survivor, Portrait of My Mother. What motivated you to write that book?
So after she passed away in 2000, I found in her apartment a remarkable collection of items, wonderful and important evidence of her incredible life. There were amazing documents from the time of her liberation from Bergen-Belsen. There were newspaper articles of her achievements, photographs, writings, lecture notes, audio tapes, and video interviews. And so I collected them all and I took them home, and they lay dormant there for 15 years. And then I began to deal with them. And initially I was going to transcribe the audio interviews and type up the handwritten notes and have them in a format which her grandchildren and great-grandchildren and future generations would be able to read. But as I read through them and I began to collate them, I realized that that wasn't enough. I came to understand how truly remarkable she was and to appreciate her personal strengths and determination, and in the way that she dealt with this indescribable trauma. And I then determined to perpetuate her mission by telling her story. For me, it was important to portray her as she saw herself, as a survivor. She embodied the Holocaust. She spent her entire life trying to make logical sense of this inexplicable trauma that ruled her life and decimated her past. The Holocaust was the eternal flame that burned within her. But to portray her as only a survivor wouldn't do her justice. There was so much more to who she was. you know, she retained her humanity and her morality throughout this time, and she survived. And then she went on to rebuild her life and to live it to the full with this amazing optimism and determination. And so perpetuating the mission that was her eternal flame became my motivation to ensure that her whole story is told.
I think now's probably a good point to look at some of these questions that have come in. Bear with me, there are a lot. So I hope I don't miss too many of them, but we'll see how we go. Okay. Did she ever continue the relationship with her girls, her adopted daughters, and did you ever meet them?
She absolutely continued that relationship. Many of them went to live in Israel. When my sister got married, at the wedding ceremony, all the girls that were alive and were in Israel were there. And she has this wonderful photo at that date. So my mum kept up relationships with everybody her whole life. All her girls, all the family. She just needed connectedness, and for her it was very important. I don't recall meeting any of the girls specifically.
Okay, given the events of the past week in the US Capitol building, what advice do you think Bobba would give us?
I think Bobba would emphasize the need to treat everybody humanely and to treat people as people, and to put racism and dividing factors as far away from the forefront as she possibly could. My mum was somebody who was very pro-Israel. So she saw the world in terms of, is it good for Israel or not? But I think her need for putting humanity first would have put her firmly in the camp of supporting people who were pro-humanity.
From what type of home did she come? Religious, traditional, Zionist? Were there any stories in the concentration camps or afterwards that she told you about trying to symbolically mark Jewish holidays, Shabbat, or aspects of Jewish tradition?
Absolutely. She came from a traditional religious family. For the rest of her life, she was an observant, kosher person, despite the fact that she had great issues believing in a God for many, 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 many years. But it didn't stop her from practicing all the traditions of the faith. She used to explain to me that keeping a kosher home was her way of honoring her parents. And in the camp, she actually described one particular incident where they had a mock Seder. It was Pesach, and they had found some potatoes which they sliced up and cooked on their stove, and that was their matzah. And she said they all remembered a portion of the Seder, and whoever remembered something recited it. And they used that as a symbolic belief that one day they would have their own Exodus.
What was your mother's attitude towards the South African policy of apartheid?
I think, again, my mother treated everybody as a human being. Everybody as a human being. If you were needy, she supported you. She would have given you the shirt off her back if she thought you needed it more than she did. I don't recall her having a specific attitude. I think she was so steeped in getting her life back together that whatever she could do was focused on the ex-Lithuanian Jewish population. So she didn't get involved in anything specifically political in South Africa. But I do believe that as part of her entire outlook on racism, she would have been appalled.
And I think that's the questions that have come in. I actually have one final question. You know, Bobba passed away in 2000. It's been more than 20 years since she died. It's been 75 years since the end of the Holocaust. If she was here today, what do you think is the one thing she would want to say or to tell people? What is the one thing what would she want people to take away from her life and from her story?
I think it would be the same message as it always has been. Never to forget what ordinary people are capable of in an unchallenged environment. She would have recounted the horrors of her past, of this indiscriminate racial and religious prejudice, in the hope that highlighting these evils would ensure that our future could be free of them. But Bobba was never bitter. She wasn't steeped in hatred or negativity. So I think her message would have included the capacity for good that people have as well. And I think she would emphasize the goal of living one's life in the best way possible, putting people and humanity ahead of possessions. She lost everything and everyone, but she never ever lost the sense of who she was or her will to live and the impetus to make her survival count. And I think she would have expected the same of us.
Thank you. I'm going to hand back to Serena now. Actually, we might just read this quote at the end. This was one that she certainly said that I think we believe strongly in. Every hour of our life to live an extra hour under those circumstances. This was courage. This was heroism. We couldn't do anything to our murderers, to our enemies, but at least we tried to defy them by trying to want to live. Thank you.
Rochy and Kerryn, we cannot thank you enough for sharing your story and the life of your Bobba, Lea Leibowitz. It's been an absolute blessing to have this time together with you both today and with friends from across the globe to listen and to learn from you and to keep Bobba's memory and heroism alive. From the bottom of our hearts, we are so thankful to you. And thank you so much to our audience, always for being with us and for writing such meaningful questions and dialogues into the chat. Rochy and Kerryn, in case you did not see, audience members were writing beautiful words of gratitude into the chat. And if I may, I just want to read two of the many. One person, Kristen Azari, wrote, "It is an honor to listen in this Zoom. The book was so impactful, heart-wrenching, and important. Thank you for your efforts to ensure this never happens again." Fred and Francis Brown said, "The way this presentation is put together is strong and powerful. The viewer sees and hears from 3 generations. The first generation lived in totally inhumane conditions. The next 2 generations are here sharing the horrors for all of us to learn from. Thank you both. Rochy and Kerryn, you're heroes. Thank you so much." And now, in conclusion of our event today, I have a few important reminders or new announcements for those joining us for the first time. After today, you will receive an email with a link to take a short survey where you can provide feedback. If you may, please just take a few moments to complete the survey. We greatly appreciate your feedback on how we can improve our time together in all of our future events. And please know the recording of today's event will be uploaded to our website by tomorrow. Please share with any family, friends, colleagues who missed this discussion, this important discussion, to watch at their leisure. There are also links being posted into the chat where you can donate to the Holocaust Center and support our mission. Thank you all so much for your financial support to keep these special programs going. Our next virtual program is this upcoming Thursday, January 14th at noon, featuring Annetta Wilson, who will be engaging us in how we can navigate uncomfortable conversations. You don't want to miss it. And then our next program, part of our In My Own Words series, is on February 7th at 3 p.m., where Bernice Lerner will interview her mom, a survivor, Ruth Mermelstein. Links are being posted into the chat where you can click, see all of our events, and register. We hope to see you all there. And on behalf of the Holocaust Center, thank you all so much for being with us today. I hope you all stay safe. Hope to see you soon at our upcoming events or in person at our museum. Please have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you so much. Thank you, Kerryn. Thank you, Rochy.